been used in conversations around gender identity and sexual orientation. And so what I'm going to do is start out by giving us just a little bit of an intro into what I mean when I say those things, because a lot of times, like, first of all, I don't want to assume that you have knowledge that you might not have. Second of all, a lot of times we use words and they have different meanings in different communities. So I want to just be give a little bit of a background in the words that I'm using, and then we're going to get in and look at a whole bunch of Bible passages. We're going to have a whirlwind tour through the Bible. So I'm very excited for it. Let's get started. Let me pull up my thing here. There we go. All right. And as Pam said, if you have questions throughout any of the presentation, feel free to put them in the chat window. I will have a hard time looking at the chat while I'm presenting, but Pam will be keeping an eye on it and grabbing questions as we go. So let's get into it. As I was saying, I first want to give us some definitions, some working definitions, so we can be all on the same page here. So when we talk about orientation, what does that mean? I'll use the phrase orientation quite a bit. Orientation, another way of saying that is your sexual orientation. We can talk about it as sexuality. Sometimes people talk about affectional orientation. So lots of different ways to talk about this. I tend to use orientation as sort of a big umbrella term for the people that you are attracted to. Basically, that's how we're describing it in the broadest sense. So your orientation is an internal thing you have, your attraction for other people. There are lots of different orientations, right? There's gay folks, lesbian folks, bisexual, pansexual, asexual folks. If you're not sure what all those words mean, that's okay. These are all just ways of, these are all identity words to talk about the people that we are attracted to. So we're going to talk a little bit more about those words in a second. The important thing, of course, with orientation is that nobody can see what your orientation is just by looking at you, right? It's something that is internal to you. So sometimes what happens is we make assumptions about people, sometimes right, sometimes not right, based on their behavior. We're looking at their affectional behavior. So that could include things like holding hands. It could include large social traditions like marriage. Those are all versions of behavior that show our orientation in the world, because our orientation, like I said, itself is not visible to other people. We also sometimes have relationship styles. So our orientation plays out in these relationship styles. So you might be a monogamous person, you might be a polyamorous person, you might be a celibate person. All of those things are kind of the case in which your orientation and your affectional behavior play out. So this is kind of the orientation side of things. This is all about who you're attracted to. You kind of who you are sort of gravitating towards sexually, romantically, any sort of like sexual, romantic, and at times emotional attraction towards other people. So this all kind of falls into orientation. The other sort of thing that I want us to talk about as an umbrella is gender, which is separate from orientation. Your gender, there's lots of different ways for us to talk about gender, depending on what sort of school of thought you come from, what sort of background you have. If you are, for instance, a biologist, you're going to have some different understandings about gender than if you're a psychologist, even though those are both have to do with how human beings work, right? But your language is going to be a little bit different. So the language that I'm using as I describe gender right now is a sort of three-piece model that was sort of developed by the folks at Gender Spectrum, which is an organization out in California, out in San Francisco. Gender Spectrum works to support transgender youth. And so as they're teaching gender to usually parents who want to understand their kids better, this is the sort of format that they use. So it's one I really like. They talk about gender as having three parts. So you've got your identity, your body, and your expression. Those are the three parts. So let's talk about those for a second. So the body section here, you can see in the little diagram, we've got the body pointing to between this little stick person's legs, because that's usually what people think of when they think about this first part. They're thinking about your external reproductive organs. But your physical, your body and the way that your body is gendered is more than just that bit. It's more than just your external reproductive organs. It's also your internal reproductive organs, your chromosomes, your hormone levels, different structures in your brain, and amounts of different kinds of things in your brain. Those are all things that are gendered in different ways. So that your body is sort of the first section of this three-piece pie. Your gender identity is your internal self-perception and experience of being female, male, both, or neither. So your identity is, we see you've got the little arrow pointing to this little stick figure's brain, right? Your identity is how you understand yourself. So we're going to talk about some complications in this model in a second here. But the third one is your gender expression. So kind of like with orientation, right? Your orientation is something nobody else can see, but we look at your behavior and we make guesses based on that, right? The same thing is true here, where your gender identity is an internal thing nobody else can see, but people can look at your gender expression. So your gender expression includes your clothing, your hair, your mannerisms. All those things have gendered values in your specific society. So something that might be thought of as a more feminine gender expression in one society might be thought of as more masculine in another society. So it's different in different places and different times. So these three sort of pieces of the gender pie are one way that we understand gender. And like I said, this is complex, right? Because no model is ever going to be perfect, I don't think. But this model is complex because these things are so interrelated. Because, for instance, we've said like your gender identity happens in your brain, right? But your brain is part of your body. So like there's a lot of crossover there. Your brain, for instance, is affected by things like your hormone levels. So none of these things exist in a vacuum. They all interact with each other and affect each other. So one more thing I'll say about this model before we move on. And that is that sometimes I will be referring to the body part of this equation as your assigned sex, or your sex assigned at birth. Basically what that means is everybody gets a sex assigned at birth. You're born and the doctor looks at your external reproductive organs, again, that one part of your body, and says it's a boy or it's a girl. Usually that's the way that it works, right? So that's your assigned sex. You're usually assigned male or assigned female at birth. However, because like I said, the body section is so much more complicated than just that one piece, that sort of assignment does not always work, does not always stick, is not always accurate. So for instance, we have about 1.7% of the population who are intersex. So they're people with variations in sex development. So they may have internal and external reproductive organs and chromosomes and hormone receptors that don't all line up along the just male or just female line. So for intersex folks, the whole being assigned male or female at birth thing doesn't work like right away, pretty much, whether they know it or not. So that's kind of an issue with this whole situation. The other thing is that for transgender folks, myself included, for transgender folks, our gender identity does not match our assigned sex. So for instance, when I was born, I was assigned female at birth. And then it took me about 23, 24 years for me to say, oh, psych, everybody, you got it wrong. I'm actually male. And it took a long time for me to understand that, for me to come out, for me to feel safe telling people about that. So for me as a transgender man, I was assigned female at birth, but I identify as and am male. So that's one way of being trans. So that's a little bit about gender and orientation. I think the easiest way to understand these things is to think of them like a Venn diagram, with orientation being one bubble and gender being the other bubble. When we're looking at the big community that we're talking about here, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, two-spirit, and asexual people, right? This is a big community. And sometimes we think, that's a lot of words. What does that all mean? One of the easier ways to understand this is by understanding where they fit, where these labels fit in this Venn diagram. So some labels have more to do with orientation, and other labels have more to do with gender, and some are right in the middle. They have to do with both orientation and gender. So just to look at these labels for a second here, Lesbian and gay are both things that we can put squarely in the orientation side of the circle, because it's all about who you're attracted to, who you are romantically, sexually, emotionally attracted to. So those ones kind of fit neatly in that one circle. Bisexual folks also fit over in that circle. And the word bisexual, it can mean being attracted to both men and women. Another way of explaining bisexual is to be attracted to people who share your gender identity and people who don't. So it kind of means everybody, right? People like me and people not like me. So bisexual, that's another way of thinking about that word. Transgender folks are over on the gender side. You get kind of a hint in the very word itself, right? So for transgender folks, that's all about gender. It's not about who you're attracted to. It's all about that body and gender identity part. So the word queer is one that can be right in the middle, and it's one that some people really love and some people really hate. It's a word that for some people, this is like a really helpful word. It talks about the sort of the amorphous nature of a lot of these things. So sometimes queer can be used for folks when they're talking about orientation. Sometimes it can be used when talking about gender. Intersex fits over on the gender side of things. Being intersex, like I said, is not about who you're attracted to. It's about having a body that doesn't all line up with our sort of expectation around male or female bodies. Two-spirit is another one that fits right in the middle there of the Venn diagram, because sometimes it can include folks of different orientations, and sometimes it can be folks of different genders. Two-spirit is a label that is used specifically within Native American or First Nations communities. So it's not one that, if you're not Native American or First Nations, that you would use. That's specifically for those communities. But it's an important one to be aware of. And then asexual folks are the last one we're going to talk about here. Believe it or not, there are plenty more that are not included on this list, but these were ones that I wanted to make sure to include. Asexual folks are people who either aren't sexually or romantically attracted to other people, or experience it at a different sort of rate. So asexual folks may not be sexually attracted to people at all, but may still be in non-sexual romantic relationships, or they may be people that only experience sexual attraction at specific times. So that's what asexual means. So this is just a very general idea of the group of people that we are talking about here. I think it's easy to look at all of these labels and go, that's too confusing. I don't know what they mean. I don't know who these people are. It makes a lot more sense when you know the people that use these words. And so it's helpful when you actually meet people, when they say, hi, and you're talking about things like orientation or gender, and they say, well, I identify as two-spirit, and you can say, well, what does that mean to you, right? Because they're going to be able to have a specific sense of what that means to them. But it can be helpful going into those conversations to have a general idea of what these words mean and where they might fit in the larger community. So with all that being said, I wanted to give us that larger sense of the group of folks that we're talking about when we're talking about becoming affirming of our siblings. However, as you may guess, a lot of these words didn't exist back in biblical times. These identities that we're talking about today are not ones that we're going to go back and be able to find in the Bible. So for instance, the word transgender, can't find it in the Bible, doesn't exist. The word homosexual didn't exist in English at all until 1892, and wasn't introduced into the Bible until the Revised Standard Version was released in 1946. So the words that we are talking about today and people use today are not words that you're going to see in our scripture passages when we're looking at them. The other complicating factor is that in biblical times, whether we're talking about sort of the ancient world in Mesopotamia, whether we're talking about the Roman Empire, what the biblical texts are talking about, they're much less concerned about how people sort of feel about things. We don't get to see a window into people's minds in the same way. So we won't be able to go back in history and say, well, does this person identify as male or female? Does this person identify as gay, right? We don't have that window into their minds. But what we are going to be looking at are specifically actions, specifically behaviors, things that we can see, because those are the things that the biblical texts tend to be the most concerned with. So I just wanted to give that heads up that when we're looking at biblical texts, we're not going to go back and say, look, there's a gay person, or there's a trans person, or there's a bi person. But we are going to go and look at specific actions and specific behaviors that the Bible talks about. So we are going to go through a whole bunch of passages. And when I talked to Pam about this, I said, would you rather go super, super deep in a few passages, or would you rather talk about a lot of passages and just like give you all information you can run with? And so we decided to go that way. So we're just going to touch very lightly on a whole bunch of passages. And with each passage we talk about, I'm going to have a specific suggestion for, like, if you want to read more about this, go here. Pam also is going to have a huge list of resources and things that you can read. So if there's anything that we talk about or like brush past here, know that there is more that you can learn about each of them. So let's start out with Genesis chapter 2, right? This is the classic second story of creation. And in this one, God says, it's not good that the man should be alone, this first human, Adam, right? So God is concerned with Adam's loneliness. And so God brings all the animals to Adam and has Adam name them, but Adam can't find a partner, right? So then finally, God creates a second person. And when Adam meets the second person, he says, this at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, for out of man this one was taken. So this is the second story of creation. We're all pretty familiar with it. For each of these passages, what I'm going to do is give us the passage, and then I'm going to give us the argument, right? What is the sort of argument made about it? And then questions that we can ask for further conversation. So this is not about me saying, here's what this passage means. This is about me saying, here's some questions we can ask with each other, with people in our congregation, with friends who want to talk about it. If you want to, like me, I'm a big nerd. I try to get my friends to talk about the Bible all the time. So if you're like me, what can we talk about? So the argument in this first passage is the Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve argument, right? That God wanted there to be one man and one woman in a relationship, and that's what we should do. So there's two questions that we might ask about this passage. First of all, what is the problem that God is addressing by creating Eve? What is the problem here? Is the problem that there's no one man and one woman? Is that the issue? And then what is Adam doing when Adam says, this is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh? So one possibility here, this is from James Brownson's book. He talks about the problem in Genesis is being aloneness, right? He says, the Genesis text portrays marriage as a solution, not for incompleteness, but for aloneness. So sometimes the argument for this will be that Adam, as a single person, was incomplete. That's why we have to have male-female pairs. But when we read the text, the concern God has is that the human should not be alone, right? So Brownson continues, and he says, God brings all the animals before the man as a potential solution to the problem of the man's aloneness, but a solution is not found. The animals are not similar to the man in many ways that the woman will be. The animals are certainly different from the man, but that's not what the story is interested in. In pursuing not difference, but someone similar to the man. So when Adam says, this at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh, on the surface, this appears to be a discovery of sameness and not difference. The primary movement in the text is not from unity to differentiation, but from isolation of an individual to the deep blessing of shared kinship and community. So basically what Brownson is saying here is, it's not a problem, theoretically here, it's not that Adam needs a woman to be complete, that you need to have these male-female pairs to complete each other, to be complementary so they can be a whole. It's that God is concerned with the aloneness of people. God wants people to have kinship and community, right? And it's not a problem about, if we have two men together or two women together, it's not a problem that they're too similar. Because that's kind of one of the arguments that is sometimes made, that like, well, you have to have difference. But in this text, the very thing that makes Adam and Eve perfect for each other is that they are more similar than anything else that God has created so far. So this is just one possible way of understanding Genesis 2. Sodom and Gomorrah, of course, is another classic text when we're talking about same-gender relationships, not because it actually seems to relate much to same-gender relationships, but because people have used it for so long as sort of one of these clobber passages. So in Genesis 19, we read this story, right? Before the men who were visiting Lot lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, young and old, all the people to the last man, surrounded the house and called to Lot, "Where are the men who come to you tonight? Bring them out to us so we may know them." Lot went out of the door to the men, shut the door after him, and said, "I beg you, my brother, do not act so wickedly. Look, I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. Let me bring them out to you, and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof." What is going on here? There's so much about this text that just does not, that sort of, I don't know, rankles us a little bit, I think, and for good reason. But the argument for this text has always been Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed because the men of the cities were attempting same-gender sexual behavior. That has been kind of the argument for this story. 2 questions we might ask instead are, is this story showing us the negative consequences of same-sex sexual behavior, or is there something else going on here? Secondly, what the heck is going on with Lot? Why would he offer his daughters to these people, right? How do we view Lot's actions today? What does this mean in context? So here's a couple of thoughts here. The first is that in Ezekiel chapter 16, we are given this sort of interesting coda on the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. In Ezekiel, it says, "This was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy. They were haughty and did abominable things before me, and therefore I removed them when I saw it." So keep that Ezekiel passage in mind for a second, because this is a quote from Matthew Vine's book here. Matthew Vine says, "Sexuality goes unmentioned in the Ezekiel passage and in every other Old Testament reference to Sodom following that Genesis 19 text. If Sodom's sin had indeed been same-sex behavior, it's unlikely that every written discussion of the city for centuries following its destruction would fail to mention that. The men of Sodom demanded that Lot bring out his guests so that the men could have sex with them, but this was not an expression of sexual desire. This was threatened gang rape." So essentially what Matthew Vines is talking about here is, what if this is not a story about same-sex relationships and how they're bad? What if this is instead a story about how any sort of sexual interaction without consent is not okay? What if this is actually a story about sexual assault and what sexual assault does to a community and to a family? Matthew also points out, in the ancient world, for a man to be raped was considered the ultimate degradation. Lot offered his daughters. His actions indicate that defending his guests was more important to Lot than defending his flesh and blood. But it's also true that the gender of Lot's guests played a role, not because of Lot's concerns about the bodily sameness in the same-sex behavior, but because of the greater honor men held in ancient times. For instance, basically what Matthew is saying is, if Lot had let these people into his house and they assaulted these male guests, that would bring more shame on Lot than having his daughters sexually assaulted, because men were worth more in this context. So what if this is a story that is more about consent and more about sexual assault than it is about the gender of the people involved? Unless we're talking about the power that different genders had at this time. A couple of the other texts that you might run into, of course, Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20, both talking about men and women and sexual relationships between the two of them. These 2 texts you might kind of look at and go, well, this is not, like the Genesis text, this is not like the Sodom and Gomorrah text. This seems to be very specific about sex between 2 men specifically. So the argument here is, of course, the law does not allow same-gender sexual behavior. So a couple of questions we might ask. First of all, what do these laws have to do with shame and patriarchy? Because like we just heard, when we're talking about this particular time and place, men had more power and more honor in this particular culture than women did. And to treat a man like a woman in a sexual sense was to dishonor that man. So you'll notice that in these Leviticus texts, they're not concerned about the honor of the women, right? This is not saying two women shouldn't be together. This is specifically saying two men should not be together, because in that case, one man would be dishonored, depending on how that sexual relationship progressed. So what does this have to do with shame and patriarchy, rather than what a sexual relationship between two people of the same gender might actually mean? Second question is, what parts of this Mosaic law that we find in the Hebrew Bible, specifically in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, what parts of that law are still relevant for Christians today? And that's a really complicated question, right? I think a lot of us, especially if we are in ministry in any case, there are going to be times when we have to go, how do we deal with this text that maybe doesn't seem to relate very much to how people live today, right? And different traditions and different church traditions are going to have different views on how to deal with that. For instance, one of the things, I'm from a Lutheran tradition. One of the things that Luther suggested as a way of looking at the Bible was to always look for the way that scripture and stories point toward God's redemption in the world and point toward Jesus specifically, right? And he said that the things that point toward that are going to be more important than sort of the rest of scripture. The way he put it was that there's the straw that holds the baby Jesus, and you have to figure out what's straw and what's Jesus. And of course, that's going to be difficult because we're talking about Leviticus. There is no Jesus in Leviticus, really. So this is a complicated way of thinking about it, but it's still a lens that we can use to understand this a little bit better. So here's a lens, right? This is a classic lens for Christians, is what Jesus said about what's the most important commandment, right? The people come together and they ask Jesus, what commandment is the greatest? And he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And the second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. So when we're looking at those Leviticus texts, sometimes what I will do is I will say, does this text help me love God and love my neighbor? And I think when we see situations where texts like those Leviticus texts are used to harm our neighbors, actively harm our neighbors, then that's something we have to wrestle with. We have to decide, is that something that is that straw or is that love, right? How do we look at the particular texts through this lens of loving God and loving your neighbor as yourself? So one possible way to think about it. When we're looking at the Romans text now, this is a passage from Romans 1. Paul says, for this reason, and of course you have to ask yourself, for what reason, right? Like, go back, what Paul is talking about here is idolatry. These people are worshiping another God. And so Paul says, for this reason, because of idolatry, God gave them up to degrading passions. Their women exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural, and in the same way also the men, giving up natural intercourse with women, were consumed with passion for one another. Men committed shameless acts with men and received in their own persons the due penalty for their error. So here's another passage, kind of like the Leviticus ones, where we look at it and we go, that seems pretty specific. What does this actually mean? How do we deal with this? It's also, interestingly, that we're now seeing a passage that talks about women, right? Like, we didn't really see that before, and now we're seeing a passage that talks about women and women's relationships. So the argument here that people will make is that same-gender sexual behavior is unnatural and dangerous, right? Because we're seeing they exchange natural for unnatural, right? And then at the end of it, we see people receiving due penalty for their error. So unnatural and dangerous, right? But we got to ask some questions, right? First of all, what does Paul mean by degrading and unnatural? I'm going to look at a quote here in just a second that goes more into this in the larger book. But when Paul uses the words unnatural, what he means in context in his letters, when we look at the different times when he uses it, is just to say, this is not normal in our society. He doesn't mean unnatural like doesn't occur in the natural world. That's not what he means by it. So for instance, when in 1 Corinthians, he says, nature teaches you that if a man wears long hair, it is degrading to him. He talks about how that's an unnatural thing. He's not saying, men are physically incapable of growing their hair long. He's saying that's just not how we do it around here. So when Paul's using that unnatural wording, that's what he's talking about. So it's not, we have plenty of examples in the natural world of same gender pairings. So when Paul's talking about unnatural, that's what he means is we don't do that here. So again, how do we understand this in the context of patriarchy? How do we understand this in terms of a man having more worth in this society than a woman, and that two men together would necessitate one man being shamed? What are we talking about here when we're talking about the patriarchal context of the text? And then how much of this passage has to do with a warning against lust and excess? So that's where this next quote is going. This is from David P. Gushie's book. He says, "We know that same-sex behavior in the Greco-Roman world very often, though not always, looked like pederasty, prostitution, and master-slave sex. These acts were criticized by pagan moralists, not just Christians. They were primarily indulgences of privileged men who had the power to take and use other people's bodies for pleasure, and the luxury to spend a fair amount of time messing around with all different kinds of sex. For these men, a wife alone was not enough. They wanted novelty, excess, pleasure of ever more exotic kinds. The first century Roman philosopher Musonius Rufus, for example, wrote, 'Not the least significant part of the life of luxury and self-indulgence lies in sexual excess. Those who lead such a life crave a variety of loves, not women alone, but also men.' Some argue that Paul is reacting to the cultural sexual excess, selfishness, and sanctioned adultery in Romans 1, and that the same-sex part of the problem was incidental rather than central." So basically, what Gushie is saying here is, it's not that Paul necessarily had a problem with the gender of the people in these relationships. It's that he's saying these people's appetites were going so wild that it didn't, like, sort of the gender of the people involved didn't matter. Like, you wanted more than you were supposed to have. And so that's an interesting way of thinking about it. I do want to point out that when we're talking about orientations today, if we're talking about something like people who are bisexual or pansexual who are attracted to people of multiple genders, it doesn't mean that they're greedier or have a higher libido or anything like that. That's not what we're talking about here in terms of like attraction to people. This was specifically about in Paul's time, this was about using other people for your own satisfaction, regardless of their own individual sort of autonomy and ability to be respected and valued as a person. So 1 Corinthians and 1 Timothy, we're not going to read the whole thing here, but both of these provide what's called a vice list. You might be familiar with vice lists in the Greco-Roman world. Basically, what you would do is you would write to, a philosopher, somebody who you really, really respected, and you would say, teach me how to live my life. Teach me what I should do and what I shouldn't do. And they would write these lists of like, here are all the virtues and here are all the vices, right? So in 1 Corinthians and 1 Timothy, we see Paul writing a couple of vice lists where he says, such and such people, should not inherit the kingdom of God. And he includes these two words, malakoi and arsenokoitai, in these lists. And over time, these words have been translated in various ways, but they've been translated as sodomite, as homosexual. Two words, of course, sodomite, going back to that story that may have nothing to do with same gender relationships, and homosexual being something that didn't come around until, like I said, the 1600s. So these two words, these two Greek words, we don't really know what Paul meant by them when he includes them in this list of bad things. We don't really know what exactly Paul meant. So the question here is, how do we understand these words, malakoi and arsenokoitai, that were written in a place and time when same-gender sexual acts could only be performed in these contexts where one person is using another person and not respecting them, not honoring them, right? No romantic relationship between equals was tolerated in this time. So what do we do with these two words? This is an excerpt from Gordon Fee's commentary on 1 Corinthians, and it's quoted in Ken Wilson's book, A Letter to My Congregation. He points out that the first word, malakoi, has the basic meaning of soft, but also came to mean effeminate, most likely referring to the younger or passive partner in a pederastic relationship. So basically, you've got these two people in a relationship, and again, these two men in a relationship, and because of the way this culture worked, one of those men has to have less power than the other. One of them has to be feminized in a way, and to be sort of brought lower in the social structure. But anyway, the interesting thing here is that there was a technical word. He says there was a technical word for these men who were involved in same gender relationships, but malakos is not usually the word that is used for that. It's not the ordinary word for homosexual behavior. One cannot be sure what it means in a list like this, where there's no further context to help. He also says the word arsena koitai is also difficult because it's in a bunch of literature, but it's unspecific. In fact, we think that arsena koitai might have been a word that Paul made up because it's a combination word of men or male and bed. And we think Paul might have just smashed them together to try to make his own word. So we don't really know what that word means either. So when we're looking at these two words, to say this means gay people, especially to say this means gay people like we know gay people today, is just a real stretch. So we want to be really careful about these Greek words. So to think for a second, we've kind of been through a bunch of these clobber passages, right? And I think it's interesting to look at a couple of passages that have actually been interesting for scholars and for lay people when we look at same gender relationships in a more positive sense. The most classic example, of course, is David and Jonathan, right? In 1 Samuel, we get this story about David and Jonathan making this pact together. When David had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was bound up to the soul of David. Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. Jonathan stripped himself of the robe he was wearing and gave it to David and his armor and even his sword and his bow and his belt. One of the super interesting things about that story is that the giving of a cloak, or like putting your cloak over somebody, was part of a lot of ancient marriage ceremonies. So giving your cloak to somebody else or wrapping your cloak around somebody else showed this sort of covenant of becoming family. And so it's super interesting that we notice that in this David and Jonathan story, there's a moment where not only do they have this sort of pact together, but Jonathan actually gives his clothes to David, right? It's a super interesting thing too when you think about, you remember the story of David and Goliath and how David was dressed up in Saul's armor. Saul said, wear my armor and go out and fight Goliath. And David was like, I can't move in this. This doesn't work for me, Saul. I can't wear your armor. But in this story, David is actively taking on what Jonathan is giving. Jonathan is giving of himself. So it's a really interesting story of these two of them. We're then told, of course, in Samuel, there's this song that David writes after Jonathan is killed in battle, where David says, I'm distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Greatly beloved were you to me. Your love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. And so we read that and like, sure, we can try to explain that away, but your love is passing the love of women is another one of those things that seems pretty interestingly straightforward, even though both of these men had families, right? Both of these men had wives and children. But again, it's because relationships in this time and place are not like the relationships that happen today, because our social structures are so different. So there's more reading there by James Harding if you're interested in this story. Another one here is the story of Ruth and Naomi, right? One of the things people know right away is the similarity between what happens between Ruth and Naomi and what happens in Genesis 1 between Adam and Eve. When Naomi's trying to get Ruth to leave, we read that Ruth clings to Naomi, and it's the same sort of language that is used when we learn about in the end of Adam and Eve's story, where we hear, therefore a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife. That language of clinging to is very similar, and people have noted that sort of throughout Christian study and Jewish study as well. And noted that similarity and said, interesting. What's going on here? That's compounded, of course, by Ruth's speech to Naomi in the middle of chapter 1, where Ruth gives this beautiful speech, where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. So this speech that Ruth gives, it's one of those speeches about love that we recognize is so much about love that we speak it at marriage ceremonies. Like, this is used in marriage all the time between same gender couples and different gendered couples. One of the things, I actually think I read this in Stephanie Day Powell's book here, but a scholar saying it's interesting that in marriage ceremonies that we use today, we say till death do us part, but Ruth was not content with till death do us part. Ruth went once beyond that. Not even death will part me from you. I will be buried with you, right? So this is almost a declaration of love, even more powerful than the ones we see in modern marriage ceremonies. So the relationship between Ruth and Naomi is one that is, again, not equivalent to relationships today, but still a really interesting one for scholarship. And the last story I'm just going to touch on here is the story of Jesus and the centurion in Matthew chapter 8. This story also shows up in Luke. A centurion comes to Jesus and says, "Lord, my servant," in Greek the word is pais, "is lying at home, paralyzed and in terrible distress." And he said to him, "I will come and cure him." The centurion answered, "Lord, I'm not worthy to have you come under my roof, but only speak the word, and my servant will be healed. For I am also a man under authority, with soldiers under me. And I say to one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes. And to my slave, do this, and the slave does it." Then Jesus heard him. He was amazed and said to those who followed him, "Truly I tell you, in no one in Israel have I found such faith." So the reason that this story is interesting for LGBTQ plus scholars today is because of that word for the servant, pais, that is used. It's a word that in other contexts, so if you look for pais in the New Testament, you're going to find it in this story in Matthew 8. You're going to find it in the same story in Luke's version. And then there's like 3 or 4 other times where this word is used, and it's always used to mean young boy. It's always used to mean a younger, like prepubescent boy, right? So that's where you find it in the New Testament. In the wider extra biblical canon of Greek literature, pais was not just used to mean younger boy. It was also used to mean somebody's same gender lover who was in that sort of sub position under another man. So we see that in the extra biblical literature. And so it's interesting when we look at this story specifically, that when the centurion is saying, my servant, this person, this pais, and I'm so concerned for them, there's a lot about this story that points to the fact that the centurion and this person would have been in some kind of sexual relationship, even if it, again, was not a relationship of equals, right? So the reason that's interesting to us is not just because it shows up, but because Jesus doesn't seem to say anything about it. If Jesus catches on to this, it doesn't seem to bother him. And he then affirms the faith of the centurion at the end of the story. It's another interesting thing to read this story with a group of people who are gay or lesbian folks after you've kind of talked about this complexity of the language. I've read this in Bible studies with folks before and had them point out the way that the centurion responds to Jesus, where the centurion says, like, "I'm not worthy to have you come to my house." And I've had people say, that sounds like this person felt maybe some shame about this relationship and didn't want Jesus to come in. They wanted to keep Jesus at sort of arm's length. Like, no, Jesus, like, don't come to my house. You might disapprove of me. Like, this might be more than you bargained for. Just like say the word and he'll be healed, right? And so it's interesting when we think about like how we read these texts with our community members. They may be seeing things in this text that we might not see right away. So those were the passages around orientation, around same gender couples. And we're going to go through some passages regarding gender and gender expression next. So I just want to remind us that when we're talking about gender, we're talking about our sort of physical expressions of gender. We're also talking about the way that we don't just express that with our bodies, but also with our clothing, also with our gender roles. So those are all the things we're going to be talking about in this section. Let me have a drink of water and we'll go for it. I know I'm a fast talker, so thank you for bearing with my fast talking. We have a lot to look at. So going back to Genesis, we talked about Genesis chapter 2 before. This is Genesis chapter 1, right? This is the first story of creation. And here, this is where people are created in God's image, right? So in the middle here, we get God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. And then God says, you're blessed and now go multiply, right? So this story, when we're reading the first version of Genesis, we get this sort of very specific thing where the first two people are created at the same time, right? God creates them male and female. So the argument here is that God created men and women, period. That's it. You don't get to, you don't get to be anything outside of those two very specific boxes, and you definitely don't get to bring your box back in with a receipt and try to exchange it. None of that is allowed. You get men and women. So some questions we might want to ask about this. Does this passage actually confirm the two-box system, having only men and women, right? And only what we talk about as cisgender men and women. So just for a moment for definitions there, transgender, like I said, is somebody whose gender identity is different from their sex assigned at birth. A cisgender person, CIS, cisgender person, is somebody whose gender identity and sex assigned at birth are the same. So if the doctor said, hooray, it's a girl when you were born and you identify as a woman, you're a cisgender person. So that's kind of what we're talking about here. So are we talking about just two kinds of people, cisgender men and cisgender women, or is there more? The second question we might ask about this passage is, how do we understand the power sharing dynamic between God and the humans? Because going back to this text, when I say power sharing, what I mean is, first of all, God says, let us make humankind in our image, right? So there's some kind of thing where God is giving humans something that the other animals don't seem to have, right? The second thing is God says, be fruitful and multiply and have dominion, right? So God is giving humans power here. What does it mean that God is giving humans some kind of power? So those are two questions to ask about this text. So when we're talking about being made male and female, when it says God made them male and female, does that just mean two? Well, when we look back through the whole creation story, what do we see in that first chapter of Genesis? We see God saying, let there be light, and then separating the light from the darkness. We see God creating the sun and the moon, one for the day, one for the night. We see God creating the land and separating it from the sea. In all of these places, God is creating this sort of two-box system, right? Day, night, sun, moon, land, sea, two boxes all the way down, right? But of course, when we look at the world around us, we recognize that there is space in between those two boxes, right? We're looking here at a time lapse of the evening, right? So at what point do we go, there, that's the differentiation between day and night. Of course, if you're a meteorologist, maybe you have a specific answer for that based on what we've had to decide collectively as humans. But there's even a meteorological thing of dusk and dawn, right? It's when there's light out, but the sun hasn't crested the horizon yet. Where is the dusk and the dawn in Genesis 1? It doesn't exist. That doesn't mean it didn't actually exist and God didn't create it. It just means God doesn't, we don't mention it in this particular text, but that doesn't mean that it's bad or it doesn't exist. The same thing for land and sea, right? We get all kinds of things in creation that aren't just land or sea. Estuaries, coral reefs, marshes, beaches, all these things that are in the middle, right? So when we're looking at the world, we recognize that not all of creation exists in Genesis 1, because then it would be an encyclopedia. It's just a poem, and it's giving us these broad strokes. And I shouldn't say it's just a poem. It's a very influential and important poem, but it's a poem. It doesn't contain everything. So when we're looking at this, what might it mean when it says male and female? Might there be more in the middle there as well? I think this is a really interesting chart, and you'll find ones like it all over the place. This is a specific chart of average height for men and women. And what we've got here, if you're familiar with charts and graphs, this is a double bell curve. So what you have is one sort of top of the curve for women there that says most women are about 163 centimeters tall. And the second curve for men says most men are about 177 or 8 centimeters tall, right? So that's where most people fall in those two big curves. But there's a huge overlap in the middle, and there's a huge sort of tailing off at the end of either one of those curves, right? So even though most women might be in this middle part and most men might be in this middle part, there's a ton of crossover. And this is specifically with height, right? With average height. But this is the case with almost every physical characteristic that we think of as like a sex-based characteristic. Whether we're talking about the size of somebody's chest, we have men with very large chests, women with very small chests, right? Like any characteristic you think of in terms of people's bodies is going to show up in a double bell curve like this. And it's not two boxes. It's a lot of people here and a lot of people here and a lot of people in the middle. So that's interesting and important to recognize when we're thinking about these middle spaces in Genesis. So Megan DeFranza is a scholar who talks about intersex folks and Christianity. She says the simplistic binary model is no longer sufficient. A binary model meaning one box or the other. It's dishonest to the diversity of persons created in the image of God. So she talks about how if we think about Genesis 1 as being just cisgender men and cisgender women, first of all, that totally ignores intersex folks, right? So it totally pushes those folks to the side, regardless of anybody else we're going to talk about. They were created like that, just like you and I were born the way we were born. Justin Tanis, when we're talking about how humans are given that power-sharing relationship, Justin Tanis says, we can argue that from the beginning, humanity has been invited by God to participate in the creation process. The development of our lives, our minds, our bodies, and our spirits over the course of our lifetimes has been given to us as a responsibility from God. Therefore, the ways in which we have learned to modify our bodies to reflect our spirit could be part of this creative process that has been ongoing from the origins of humanity. We share with God the responsibility for creating our lives. So Justin, who is a transgender scholar, talks about how part of what it means to be a good steward of your body is, using things like medical care to make sure that you can be a healthy person. And for transgender people, sometimes that means changing parts of your body for your health. In the same way that you might get LASIK eye surgery, to fix differences in eyesight. In the same way that we may have any number of ways that we use science in the way that we have vaccines, right? to stay happy and healthy people. So what if this is part of our power sharing relationship with God, that God is a creator, we are made in God's image, therefore we create things and we create ways for people to be healthy. Deuteronomy 22:5 is another verse that's sometimes used against transgender folks. It says, a woman shall not wear a man's apparel, nor shall a man put on a woman's garment, for whoever does such things is abhorrent to the Lord your God. So this, like the Leviticus text that we talked about earlier, is one of those like, that seems pretty straightforward until you start looking closely at it. So the argument here is that trans people, because of this verse, shouldn't be allowed to express their gender in authentic ways through clothing. So the questions that we might want to ask here are, first of all, what kind of clothing is Deuteronomy 22:5 talking about? When it's talking about man's apparel and woman's garment, what does that mean? For instance, something that is considered men's wear in one place might be women's wear in another place. Deuteronomy was only talking to a very small group of people, so it could say that here's what men wear, here's what women wear. But in light of modern cultural diversity and global Christianity, there is no way to say, all Christian women all over the world need to wear sundresses and all Christian men all over the world need to wear suits, right? Because that's not, that's colonialism, and we've collectively decided that that's bad. So when we're thinking about like, how does this actually work? What is men's and women's clothing? There's the cultural part to it. There's also the part, when you think about it, for instance, I'm a transgender man, I wear men's clothing, therefore I'm not breaking this rule. If you think about like, this is, if it tried to be the kind of thing where people said, you have to wear the clothing of the gender that you are, transgender people wouldn't have a problem because we know what gender we are and we'll wear the clothes that make sense of that. So it's kind of a tricky wordplay thing there. This is a tricky verse to try to figure out. The last question here is, how do we honor the fact that some people in Scripture didn't seem to follow this piece of the law? And so I want to bring up one story that kind of highlights the fact that there are people in Scripture, in the Bible, that wear stuff that technically doesn't fit their gender. One of those people, oh, hang on, I'm going to go to this and then I'm going to come back. One of those people was Joseph. We think about Joseph as being the one who had the coat of many colors, or the Technicolor dream coat. Joseph had this thing that in the NRSV is translated as a long robe with sleeves. I've got the Hebrew there. The Hebrew is kechanet pasim. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. So Joseph has this thing, this kechanet pasim. And it's translated in a ton of different ways in different English translations. There's coat of many colors, coat with long sleeves, coat with tassels, beautiful coat. There's a lot of ways we've translated this, kechanet pasim. And the reason we've translated it so many different ways is because we don't actually know what kechanet pasim means in Hebrew. Kechanet, we know. Kechanet is just robe. That's easy. But a kechanet pasim is something that we don't find in the rest of Scripture. So if you look through the Bible and you try to find, like, where else is there a kechanet pasim, there's only one other place in the whole Bible that this shows up. And it shows up in 2 Samuel 13, where it talks about King David's daughter Tamar. And it said, she was wearing a long robe with sleeves, a kechanet pasim, for this is how the virgin daughters of the king were clothed in earlier times. So we have a story with a kid wearing this thing, a kechanet pasim. We don't know what it is. And then we have a story where we're specifically told this is a princess dress. And when you put two and two together, you go, hang on a second, what is Joseph wearing? Is Joseph wearing a dress? And to our ears, that might be like, what's going on here? Jewish scholars, who of course have had this story a lot longer than Christian scholars have read Joseph as canonically gender nonconforming for hundreds of years. This is not a surprise in Jewish scholarship, but Christians are kind of only just recently getting to it in like the past 50 years. But this idea of Joseph as being a gender nonconforming person actually like sets up in the rest of his whole story. So to find out more about that, I highly recommend this text from the book Torah Queries that talks about Joseph's story. But going back for a second, thinking about that Deuteronomy 22:5 verse and about clothing, I think it's interesting to bring in Thomas Aquinas, famous Catholic theologian Thomas Aquinas, and what he said about this verse. He said, outward apparel should be consistent with the estate of the person according to the general custom. So let's stop there for a second and notice that Aquinas says, this can't be a worldwide thing. It has to be just depending on where you live and your general custom, right? He says, it is in itself sinful for a woman to wear man's clothes or vice versa, especially since this may be the cause of sensuous pleasure, and it is expressly forbidden in the law because the Gentiles used to practice this change of attire for the purpose of idolatrous superstition. So basically what Aquinas was saying, he was agreeing with a lot of other theologians from his time and from ours that think that Deuteronomy 22:5 was written because people who were worshiping other gods were dressing in a different way. They were more open with the way that they dressed and their gender expectations. And so possibly what Deuteronomy was worried about was the slippery slope argument. Don't start dressing like those people because then you'll start worshiping their God. So that's kind of the argument why we think this was written. Aquinas finishes and he says, nevertheless, this may be done sometimes without sin on account of some necessity, either in order to hide oneself from enemies or through lack of other clothes or some similar motive. So even Aquinas recognizes that there need to be some loopholes in this. There need to be some sort of pastoral considerations, even if we take this text absolutely literally. And interestingly enough, this text, Thomas Aquinas's understanding of Deuteronomy was used in the defense of Joan of Arc's trial. They brought Thomas Aquinas's text up and they said, look, Joan she was hiding herself from enemies. That's why she was doing this. So she can't be punished for it. And unfortunately, they were so insistent on punishing poor Joan that even this defense didn't work. But interesting to know from Thomas Aquinas. So this text here from Deuteronomy 23:1 is a text that's specifically about how we change our bodies. So Deuteronomy 23:1, I sometimes laugh because I grew up evangelical and I grew up memorizing a lot of Bible verses, but this was never a memory verse that I had to, to keep to memory. But this verse says, no one whose testicles are crushed or whose penis is cut off should be admitted to the assembly of the Lord, period. So we've got this text, and a lot of times people will use this text to say that transgender people shouldn't be allowed to change their bodies, shouldn't be allowed to change stuff about their bodies because, especially anything about their external reproductive organs. So a lot of questions about this verse, right? First of all, what does the assembly of the Lord mean? Does that specifically mean, the Hebrew community of the time, and therefore maybe not today? Does it just mean, anybody who worships the God of Israel, that, you can't be part of that community? Does it mean, one of the theories is that it meant that you couldn't marry a Jewish woman if you were somebody who had something like this happen to you, that you couldn't marry a Jewish woman because they were concerned that then you wouldn't be able to have kids. And some scholars think that this was specifically about not being able to worship in the temple. If you were somebody that had something changed about your external reproductive organs, you couldn't worship in the temple with the other people. So all those things are possibilities here. Does this verse have top billing, or are there overriding concerns? One of the things that I think is super interesting about our relationship with our Jewish siblings is that out of the 4 main branches of Judaism, 3 of them are affirming of transgender people. 3 out of the 4 of them are affirming. And they're affirming because even though they have this verse in their text, just like we have it in ours, they recognize that the most important thing that you can do for somebody else is to save their life. Saving a life is the most important thing. And they say, if a trans person having gender affirming surgery saves their life, that's more important than this particular verse. So we can't sort of fault like, well, people that take it literally, like they're just going to be non-affirming and that's just the way it is. That's not true. Our Jewish siblings take this text very seriously, but they also recognize that it's more important to keep people alive. So does this verse have top concern, or are there other overriding concerns? Does this verse apply to everybody or only people with these reproductive organs? Because as somebody assigned female at birth, I don't have these reproductive organs. And so technically it doesn't apply to me. Bam, solved. So what do we deal with that? Is this the kind of thing that should only penalize people assigned male at birth? And then that question that we have, the same as in the Leviticus text, is this, how do we decide which parts of the Mosaic law are relevant for us? And then the final question, which is the one I want to dig more into, is how do we understand this verse in light of eunuchs throughout the rest of Scripture? So eunuchs were usually people who were assigned male at birth and then who had their reproductive organs changed. That's usually the case, not always. We also have some texts that talk about how intersex people with variations in sex development, sometimes also got lumped into the eunuch category if they couldn't have their own biological kids. So when we're talking about eunuchs, we sometimes mean people assigned male at birth who are castrated, and sometimes we mean intersex folks. So let's keep that in mind as we go forward. Oh, here's what I just said. I didn't realize I had a text for that. But the other thing that we should note about eunuchs is that in the ancient world, in Babylon and Persia and Egypt, eunuchs were treated as a third gender in sort of everyday life. They were treated as people who could move between gendered spaces. So a eunuch could be in women's spaces. And of course, we oftentimes associate eunuchs with like the harem, right? They're the keepers of the harem. So eunuchs could be in women's spaces, but they could also be in men's spaces. They were not considered women or men. They were a whole thing unto themselves. And so that's the reason that eunuchs in Scripture are so interesting for transgender scholars today, not because eunuchs and transgender people are the same. That's not what we're talking about, but rather because eunuchs are an example of a gender outside the binary in our very scriptures. Eunuchs are an example of gender diversity in the Bible. So that's why they're so interesting to us today. So let's take a look at a couple of them here. I know this is very small text. I apologize. I'm going to read out the relevant pieces. The first text we have here is Isaiah chapter 56. And this is a text that was written at the time of the reconstruction of Israel after the Babylonian captivity. The Israelites have come back from Babylon and they're rebuilding. And they're trying to figure out sort of who's in and who's out in this new community. And there's this beautiful proclamation, sort of thus says the Lord prophecy moment in Isaiah 56. And it says, "Do not let the foreigner joined to the Lord say, the Lord will surely separate me from his people. And do not let the eunuch say, I am just a dry tree. For thus says the Lord, to the eunuchs who keep my Sabbaths, who choose the things that please me and hold fast my covenant, I will give in my house and within my walls a monument and a name better than sons and daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that shall not be cut off." So this text from Isaiah here is this moment where we kind of have a tension in the text between Deuteronomy and Isaiah. Deuteronomy says, no eunuchs allowed in, period. Isaiah says, God is specifically welcoming eunuchs, not just into the community, but into the temple, in my house and within my walls, right? And that they have a special blessing. So there's a tension here in the reconstructing community of Israel, that God seems to be giving sort of a new law, kind of changing things up a little bit. And so that's interesting for us to kind of watch the progression of throughout Scripture, because as far as we understand, even though we have this beautiful proclamation in Isaiah, apparently it was never really carried out, because we're still told sort of in later texts that eunuchs are still seen as second-class citizens, that they are still not allowed in specific places, in holy places. So even though we have this beautiful saying in Isaiah, apparently it never really came to pass. So in Matthew, when we get to Jesus's time, Jesus says, not everyone can accept this teaching, but only those to whom it is given. For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth, eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others, and eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. So Jesus gives us these sort of three categories of eunuch, right? And it's interesting because the first category, eunuchs who have been so from birth, we have good reason to believe that Jesus actually was talking about intersex folks there, people who have differences in sex development right from the moment they're born. Jesus would have known about intersex folks because we know this because in the Talmud, the collection of Jewish oral law and tradition, which was being compiled around Jesus's day, and then about 100 years after Jesus was born, they started sort of actually writing it down. In the Talmud, they talk about 6 different ways that intersex people might exist in the world, 6 different sort of variations that people are familiar with in that time. So Jesus would have known about intersex folks. So when he says eunuchs who have been so from birth, that makes sense. Eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others are, of course, people who were castrated. So that kind of makes sense of that. Eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven is what everybody argues about. What does that mean? Who is Jesus talking about? And realistically, we don't know for sure. But it is interesting that Jesus holds eunuchs up as a model, as a good thing. Jesus doesn't look down on eunuchs and say, yes, these second-class people who shouldn't be allowed in. Jesus says these people understand something about the kingdom of heaven. The last story, of course, is the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts chapter 8. This person who has all of these marginalized identities in terms of like their relationship with the early Christian community in Jerusalem, right? So this person would have been a Black person from Africa, an Ethiopian person who was not of the same race or ethnicity as the early Christians. They would have been a eunuch, so again, outside of sort of the bounds of gender. And they appear to be somebody who was familiar with the Jewish scriptures and who went to Jerusalem to pray, but doesn't appear to be Jewish themselves. So this is like prior to the first Gentile converts, right? That happens 2 chapters later in Acts. So there are all these reasons that the Ethiopian eunuch doesn't fit in to the early Christian church. All these reasons why Philip, who is the person who meets them, would have been able to say, you know what? I don't know if you fit here. Maybe like go back to Ethiopia. We'll have a conference about it, and then we'll come back and let you know what we think, right? Philip could have done that, but that's not what happens. As they're going along the road, they come to some water, and the eunuch says, look, here is water. What is to prevent me from being baptized? He commanded the chariot to stop, and both of them, Philip and the eunuch, went down into the water, and Philip baptized him. Philip doesn't require the sinner's prayer. Philip doesn't require creeds to be recited. Philip doesn't require the eunuch to say, I repent of being a eunuch. I'll go back to dressing like a man. None of that exists. Philip just baptizes this person, period, without going back to Jerusalem and asking for permission. Just does it. So that story of the Ethiopian eunuch is one that is, I think, really, really important when we think about what our affirmation for people can look like. So 2 quotes here. One is from that book I recommended before, Megan DeFranz's book on intersex Christians. And the other one is from David J. Hester's book. These 2 quotes are just about Jesus and eunuchs. The first one says, Jesus heals the blind, the paralyzed, the possessed, fevered, leprous, hemorrhaging, and even the dead, in every case restoring them to full societal membership. In the case of the eunuch, however, there is no implication whatsoever of illness or social deformity in need of restoration. Instead, the eunuch is held up as the model to follow. And then Megan DeFranza, of course, follows that by just noting that Jesus does with eunuchs what Jesus does with all other marginalized people. Jesus turns it around. The first shall be last, the last shall be first, and says, the eunuchs get something about this. So when we're thinking about modern Christian responses, when we're thinking about all these texts and how we respond to LGBTQ plus people today, what do we do? I want to give you 2 sort of structures that have sort of come about in responses to LGBTQ plus people. When we're talking about orientation, again, talking about people who are attracted to people of the same gender, what's kind of come about is this thing that sometimes is referred to as side A, side B, and side X theology. Side A theology, these 3 definitions are all from Q Christian Fellowship's website, qchristian.org. They were sort of the group of folks that first started documenting this. But side A theology basically fully affirms LGBTQ plus identity and same gender sex. It fully affirms same gender relationships, marriage, and sex as good and acceptable to God. Side A theology also recognizes that celibacy may be freely chosen for many reasons, including individuals along the spectrum of asexuality. So side A essentially is a full affirmation of LGBTQ plus people in relationships. Side B theology is any theology that affirms LGBTQ plus identities, but maintains that Christians should refrain from same gender sex for a variety of personal or theological reasons. This includes single, celibate LGBTQ plus Christians, as well as those in celibate partnerships and mixed orientation marriages. So basically, side B Christians understand that to be gay, to be lesbian, to be bisexual is not inherently bad. You're just not supposed to be in same gender relationships, or you are supposed to be celibate in those relationships. So that's sort of the side B theology. Side X theology sees any sort of same gender relationships and same gender, any sort of LGB identities, being gay, being lesbian, being bisexual, as inherently disordered or illegitimate or outside of God's approval or blessing. So this is the side that essentially uses ex-gay ideology and things like conversion therapy. And as it says here at the very last sentence, ex-gay theology is both dangerous and medically discredited. Be very clear about that. So you've kind of got this sort of 3-tiered system, side A, B, and X. And so when we're looking at modern responses to same gender relationships and lesbian, gay, bisexual identities, most people are going to fall into one of these boxes. Either you're totally affirming, you're affirming of identity, but think people should be celibate, or you think it's not okay at all, right? Those are kind of the 3 boxes that people tend to fall into. When we're talking about gender and gender identity, there's a very similar thing that happens. These are 3 lenses that were sort of written about by Mark Yarhouse. He wrote a book called Understanding Transgender Dysphoria, which is very, I will not recommend that book necessarily, unless you really want to learn more about these 3 lenses. But he talks about 3 lenses here in the same way that there's, in the same ways that there's A, B, X for orientation. there are three things he calls the integrity lens, the disability lens, and the diversity lens. He talks about the integrity lens as essentially saying being transgender is wrong and bad and disordered, right? That this is something that God does not like, and that people who are trans are making a sinful moral choice. That's the first lens, right? The second lens is the disability lens, which is what Yarhouse himself sort of argues for. And he says, it's not that transgender people are morally wrong, it's just that they're sick. It's just that they need to be fixed. So that's kind of the second view, that it's not wrong to be transgender, but it is wrong to transition. It is wrong to have any sort of physical transition, wrong to sort of like change your name, your pronouns, any sort of thing like that is what's wrong. It's not being trans because that's not your fault. It's just that you're sick. So that's sort of the disability lens. The diversity lens is the one that basically all trans theologians themselves move toward, which is saying it's not wrong to be trans. It's also not wrong to transition. It's part of being good stewards of our bodies and our spirits and our emotions, right? Rather, being trans is exactly how God made us on purpose, that we are trans on purpose and that God loves us just the way that we are. So you'll notice in both of these things, both with orientation and with gender, you've got these sort of three-tiered systems of like, either it's totally morally wrong, it's not morally wrong, but you just can't act on it, or it's okay and God loves you the way that you are. So whether you're talking about orientation or gender, those are kind of the things that people tend to see. It's important to note the actual fruit of all of these theology pieces, because the fruit of non-affirming theology is an increased level of mental health disturbance in LGBTQ plus people, an increased risk for suicide in LGBTQ plus people. So the fruit of non-affirming theology is really, really bad and really harmful. It's really harmful to people. The fruit of affirming theology, on the other hand, shows us churches that include LGBTQ plus people that are thriving and healthy and actively involved in their faith and have a growing faith life. So there's like a very distinct difference between the way that these theologies play themselves out in the world. The middle space bucket, I just want to say about like the sort of you're not inherently bad, but you can't act on it kind of theology that's right in the middle, has outcomes that are more similar to completely non-affirming theology. Because what it's essentially saying to you is, you're not inherently bad, but all of your impulses are bad and wrong and sinful. And that's really hard to like get, like, especially like teenagers are not going to get that. Like, God loves you, just like don't do bad things, and you are inherently moving towards bad things. They're not going to get that there's a difference there. So all of the sort of middle like space, middle bucket theology tends toward the negative outcomes, not the positive ones. And I think that's important to say and be specific about. So the last thing I will say before we go to questions, I'm so proud of us for being on time here. The last thing we'll say before going for questions is how you can actually respond. Why is being affirming a healthy and good thing? Here's why. Here's why in a nutshell, right? Because not making a choice about being affirming is actually making a choice. What happens here is because of minority stress, which is the stress that you feel when you are in a minority in your group and you have things that are acting on you in an oppressing fashion. If you are a minority, you have to assume that all spaces are inherently unsafe until proven otherwise. You have to assume if you are a gay person walking into a church that they are not affirming unless they prove to you that they are. So that is going to be the assumption from people coming into our churches, that if they are an LGBTQ plus person and they walk in, they have to assume that we're not affirming for their own safety. So if you decide, well, we're just not going to say anything in our church about it, like at least we're not saying bad stuff, we're just not going to say anything, that is still making a choice because people are still going to assume that of you. So you have to know that that is going to be the assumption of your church unless you are doing something to subvert that assumption. So the second reason, because our youth are paying attention, they know what's going on in our churches. They're going to be listening to us. If we are saying non-affirming things, they're going to notice that. If we are saying affirming things, they are going to notice that too. And if we're saying nothing at all, They're going to notice that, and they're going to assume that we are not affirming. Saying nothing is the same as being non affirming for all the people that have to assume an unsafe space for their own safety. It's important to be affirming because these people are already part of our communities. About half of LGBTQ Americans, so I can't say for Canadians, but about half of all Americans identify as Christians, although many have left their churches because of rejection. So these folks are already in our churches. Whether they're out or not is a whole nother thing. You have these people in your churches, whether you know it or not. 4, because we're called to work for justice. Which of these 3 is the neighbor, right? Go and do likewise, Jesus says, what does it look like to actually love our neighbor? If we are called to work for justice for the oppressed, that's something we need to take seriously if we're going to take our faith seriously. And then finally, affirming churches are healthier churches. There's a really great study from the Institute for Welcoming Resources that churches that go through a welcoming or affirming process have lower levels of conflict than other churches, because essentially the reason for that is if you have a really difficult conversation about something and you learn how to do that well, then you can use that same process the next time there's a really difficult conversation that comes up. So affirming churches that have been through that know how to do that, and they can do it better the next time. So you're going to have less conflict overall. So this is not just a thing that we should do because we want to be good people. It's something that we should do because it's actually good for us, for our whole community. So that is where I'm going to stop for tonight. I'm going to put up the last screen here. There we go. If you have questions and you want to get a hold of me, you can do that on my website. And then over on the right-hand side there, Transmission Ministry Collective is the organization that I am the director for. And we specifically have support groups and Bible studies, all kinds of really cool programming for transgender Christians specifically, for trans and expansive Christians. So if you or somebody that you know or love is a trans or gender expansive person who wants to be connected with other trans Christians and get involved with faith development and things like that, definitely check out our website. Our website also has a really great resource page, which is one of the things that Pam is, I think, going to share with you all at transmissionministry.com. We have a resource page specifically for pastors and ministry professionals if you want more information about any of this. So that's where I'm going to stop. Pam, do you want to take us into questions?
I do. Thank you so much, Austen. You did something that was really difficult to do. Basically, you asked me, what should I cover? And I said, everything. And you did a really amazing job. And I know that, some of us are used to a lot of disinformation, but some of us are not at all. Like if you would have talked to me 10 years ago, I would have not known any of what you just talked about in the lens that you talked about it, right? So it's really refreshing, and I really appreciate you bringing all of this scholarship and condensing some of these nuggets for us in such a short amount of time with all the lived experience and the education and all of that you bring. So thank you for doing that.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I should say, Pam, when we were talking about this, Pam said, like, just cover everything. I said, usually I do what we just did in 90 minutes in 3 hours. So right. Just so you know how fast we just did that.
Right. So we're doing good. We're doing good. So I've amalgamated some of the questions that we got, and if we don't have time to get to your question, it doesn't mean it's not important. Austen gave you his contact information, and there might be some of those answers on some of the resources that we'll give you. I'm going to copy and paste a Google folder in there, which contains 2 really great resource documents that Austen sent me, as well as a full list that has links to a bunch of different stuff. There's a lot of different content in terms of Canadian content as well. So it's a good sort of mashup of the things that we can offer together. So thank you, Austen, for contributing to that. So a really great question that we got is, what is a good way to answer someone who says that individuals shouldn't be transgender because God is perfect and doesn't make mistakes?
The classic question. That is a question that is so prevalent that when I was writing my book, that's the thing that I talk about in the introduction, because I was like, that's what everybody wants to know. So let's just do it in the introduction. So what people are saying, I think, when they say that is, like we want to believe that God makes us the way we are for a reason, right? We want to believe that God loves us the way that we are. And so for some people, they say, that's exactly what they say. God makes us the way that we are for a reason, and you shouldn't change that. That's playing God, right? And as much as I understand and I want to honor their concern, I also want to recognize all the ways that people are born in a way where things need to be changed so that they can be healthy. Like that is just so common, right? That everybody, there are so many ways that we as human beings can be made. And even though we are made wonderfully, we are not made perfect. And so there are going to be things that need to be changed necessarily. And that can show up in any number of ways. But that does not mean that we are messed up and broken and bad. It just means we're not perfect. So I think of specifically of Psalm 139 that talks about how we are, beautifully and wonderfully made, that we are knit together in our mother's womb, like this beautiful psalm. And I think about how it doesn't just mean that we are made physically, that we are knit together physically. It means that God is knitting all of us together. The Hebrew word there, when it says that we are being knit together, it doesn't just refer to this idea of our body. It also means our spirits. It also means our identities. All of those things are being made by God, and that doesn't end when we're born. We are being knit together every moment of our lives as we grow and as we change. And so for me, my understanding of being trans is that God made me trans on purpose. Maybe God gave me a specific kind of body, but God also gave me a specific kind of brain. God also gave me a specific kind of identity and spirit and personhood. And just because those two things didn't automatically go together right away, and I had to do a lot of work to be able to become myself, doesn't mean that it was any less planned or that it was bad. So yeah, for me, it's like, sure, God gave me a specific kind of body, but that doesn't mean that my body can never change. Sometimes we talk about how our bodies are temples, but the temple was rebuilt twice. And Jesus at one point said the temple could be thrown down in 3 days and rebuilt, right? Like temples change, temples get renovated. So I guess that'd be kind of the short answer.
Great, thank you. Somebody else was asking, what is the quickest way to shut down an encounter that is getting heated, but allows you to remain a fully engaged and supportive ally? And other questions that have come in that are sort of like that, I guess I could amalgamate and say, what is a way when we're having some of these, complex conversations or controversial conversations in some people's minds, to sort of end that conversation where it is for whatever reason, while still, I guess, doing it in a loving way?
Mm. That's a good question. I think there are going to be so many different answers to that depending on the situation. Because for instance, if you're talking to, I'm imagining that this question is coming from a place of like, you're talking to somebody who's maybe not affirming and you are, and it's getting heated between the two of you. Let's say for the sake of this argument that neither one of you is LGBTQ plus, like maybe you're both heterosexual cisgender people talking about this, right? Say that's the case. In that case, I think it's really, really helpful to listen to what the concern is underneath what the person is saying, because oftentimes what they are concerned about is it's not like at the forefront of what's going on in the conversation. Usually it's somebody's fear about something, that they're afraid about something. A lot of times it might be fear about somebody's immortal soul, right? Or it might be fear about, if I believe that God could make somebody with a body that's different than mine, that's going to change my whole theology. And I don't know how to deal with that, right? So a lot of times it's fear underneath people getting heated. And trying to figure out what that fear is or what that concern is can help you speak to that thing rather than maybe the surface level thing that you seem to be arguing about in that moment. So I think that that's kind of where I would try to go with that, is try to hear what's their concern, try to hear what their fear is underneath. I would say that you shouldn't just like shut down the conversation and say, I don't want to talk about this anymore, period. But sometimes you have to draw those boundaries, especially now, like I said, like that would be one case. But say I'm in a conversation with a non-affirming person and they're telling me about how transgender people are, depraved and whatever. There may be a point where I'm going to say, I'm done with this conversation because this is not, for this person, it might be a theoretical argument. For me, it's the life that I live every day, right? So we're not on the same level in conversation there. And we have to recognize that when we're talking to people. If you're a heterosexual cisgender pastor to your bisexual transgender congregant, you are on different levels when you're talking about this. And it might be that maybe your congregant does get heated, and that's legit because you're talking about their real everyday life. So you don't want to shut that down, right? You want to be acting in a pastoral way in that moment. So it is, I think, really going to depend on the specific situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Good way to answer a really big, a really big question. And it's what we all have to navigate all the time, right? Another question was asking if there are certain versions or translations of the Bible that are more inclusive than others.
Yeah, so that was one of the questions that was asked ahead of time, and it got me thinking, like, because I do get that question sometimes, and the problem is there's no perfect Bible translation, and of course, if you're a pastor or somebody who reads a lot of different Bible translations, you know this. There's no perfect translation that seems to get everything right all the time, because so many times there is no right. There's a lot of amorphous stuff going on in terms of translation. So different Bibles are good for different things. I personally think the NRSV, or the New Revised Standard Version, is a pretty good translation. It's the one that I use mostly because that's the one that's used mostly in my tradition. So it's one that I use a lot. Another one that I really like sometimes is the Common English Bible, the CEB. I really enjoy that the CEB doesn't unnecessarily gender things a lot. And so I appreciate that in their translation. However, they do sometimes have a more conservative view on what things mean. So in things like the footnotes, you might run into some things that you're like, ooh, I don't know about that. But I like some of their translations of the Common English Bible. The other one that I've just heard about, we were talking about this earlier, I'm going to put it in the chat here, is the Inclusive Bible, which I don't have a copy of personally, but I have heard some really interesting things about it. It's supposed to be the first egalitarian translation. So if you get it, you get it and tell me how it is, because I've been meaning to get one. I haven't yet.
Wouldn't it be great if there was like a truly affirming Bible?
Yes.
But it's kind of hard because it was written by a lot of humans, and we're not
Yes.
perfect. So I think that's
One,
where scholarship comes in, right? Because
exactly.
I know that we can say, a fifth grade understanding of the Bible can be dangerous even for a fifth grader, right? So if we just sort of
Yes.
take it and say like, oh, great, I know exactly what this means, and now I'm going to use it against people, right?
Right. Yep. And that's that's what I worry about anytime I do one of these, is I never want to be the person who comes in and says, this is what the Bible really says, because who am I to know, right? But to say,
Right.
like, here are some questions that we can ask about these passages is a little bit more helpful, I think. The other thing I would say that you and I talked about earlier, Pam, is that if you go to BibleGateway.com, I think it's .com, isn't it?
Yeah. So.
BibleGateway.com. You can look there, you can type in a passage and then look at like 6 different translations all together. You can look at 10 different translations all together. And I think that's honestly the most helpful way, if you're a lay person that you like don't want to go into the Hebrew and Greek and all that kind of stuff, to just look at the differences between the translations is going to tell you something, because it's going to tell you like, oh, this translation shows this word and this one shows this word. Interesting. That's going to tell you something about them. So sometimes just looking at as many as you can right next to each other is really helpful. And that's great. It's easy to do that online, thankfully. You don't have to buy 8 different Bibles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And Tracy in the comments is saying that they use the Inclusive Bible and it's great. It doesn't
Nice.
have she's right, it doesn't have the inclusive version yet.
Mm, mhm.
But yeah, BibleGateway.com gives you some of those options. And like you said, it's a good reminder, I think, especially for me and those of us who come from more conservative backgrounds where like really only one, specific thing was
Mhm,
usually used. And it's like, we can't change anything about this or question it or think differently.
mhm.
It shows you even the expansiveness of what exists out there.
Yeah.
So another question that we have is, I know that you are, and this will be the last question because I know we'll wrap up here. You're providing us with lots of resources, which is amazing. But do you have any one person or book in particular that has specifically influenced your own theological scholarship around this?
Ooh, I mean, tons. I mean, the first one that really changed the way I think about things was Justin Tanis's book, Transgender Theology, Ministry, and Communities of Faith is what it's called. Justin Tanis was like one of the first trans theologians to write a book that was accessible for everybody, that like you could read it and you didn't have to have a theology degree to read it. So that was, I think, one of the first books that ever made me go, holy crap, there's so much out here. This is great. So that was huge. Let's see. Another, you know what? I'm standing right next to my bookshelf right now. Hang on, or sitting right next to it, I should say. There's so many. Oh, you know what? I know what I'll suggest. Joy Ladin is a Jewish trans woman, and she's both a poet and a theologian. She's wonderful. And she wrote a book recently called The Soul of the Stranger. So The Soul of the Stranger by Joy Ladin, I would highly recommend. She writes about her, like the way that the Hebrew scriptures and specifically the stories in Genesis have influenced her transition and her identity as a trans woman and as a Jewish person. And she's just amazing. She's a wonderful writer. So I would highly recommend that one.
Awesome. I'm looking forward to it. I haven't heard of that one yet. Austen, what a
Yeah.
pleasure it's been to get to see you again and to hear from you and to know how much deep care and scholarship and lived experience you're bringing to this time. It's a huge gift, and I really want to name that. And I thank the regions for coming together in their affirming journey to make this a priority, to give this opportunity and this invitation for us to reflect theologically on things that, like you said, matter, because we're talking about other humans, we're talking about other
Mhm.
children of God. And for us to see this as something that we can affirm and it's faithfully affirming,
Mhm.
is really critical and life-saving. So we really
Agreed.
appreciate that.
Thank you so
And
much.
the resources that Austin provided in the folder that I shared, that Google folder, are phenomenal. There's lots of things for faith leaders, and there's lots of things for trans people of faith as well. So feel free
Yes.
to share those things far and wide. We'll also have a recording for this that we can send out to the folks on the Zoom registration list as well. And we look
I
forward
can
to.
also send,
Yeah,
sorry,
go
I could
ahead.
also send Pam if you want. I can send the PowerPoint itself if people want those, because I know there's a lot of, references to
Yeah.
other things. So if people want the PowerPoint, I
Yeah,
will send that to
that'd
Pam.
be great. Yeah, I'll include that in the email to everybody. So that's
Cool.
really generous of you to share that. So folks, this is part of the continued journey, and thank you so much for coming and sharing this time with us. It's all well worth it. I hope this gives you just a little bit more pieces of conversation that you can have with people in your community and for your own faith development. And we can sort of say goodnight to everyone, but I'll leave the room open for a minute so you can write down anything and click on that folder if you haven't had a chance. But thank you again, Austin, and thank all of you folks and the people who've attended and the awesome questions that we got to get to some of them. And this stuff really matters for our communities, like you said. So thanks, folks, and thank you,
Thanks,
Austin. You can go to
everyone.
bed now.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, bye bye.